My earliest memories aren't of bedtime stories or family picnics, they're of screaming matches and slammed doors. I'm Elsie, and for the first 8 years of my life, I watched my parents' marriage crumble one fight at a time. Dad always found something wrong with everything Mom did. The dinner was too salty. The laundry wasn't folded right. She spent too much money at the grocery store. She was teaching me bad habits. It didn't matter what she did, it was never good enough for him. "You're completely useless, Sarah," he would shout, his face red with anger. "Can't you do anything right?" I would hide in my room during these fights, pressing my hands against my ears, but their voices always found their way through the walls. After each fight, I'd hear Mom crying in the bathroom, trying to muffle her sobs with running water. The pattern continued year after year. Some days were better than others, but the tension was always there, like a storm waiting to break. Dad worked as a successful corporate lawyer, and he wielded his professional authority at home like a weapon. Mom was a stay-at-home mother who had given up her teaching career when I was born, something Dad never let her forget. "I provide everything for this family," he'd remind her during their arguments. "The least you could do is run a proper household." My 8th birthday was surprisingly peaceful. Dad even smiled a few times, and Mom made my favorite chocolate cake. Looking back now, I realize Mom must have already made her decision by then. The next morning, she was gone. No note, no goodbye, no explanation. Just empty drawers and a half-empty closet. Dad went ballistic, calling everyone we knew, hiring private investigators, but she had vanished completely. When the divorce proceedings started, she didn't show up to court. The judge granted Dad full custody and terminated her parental rights. I remember sitting in that courtroom, wearing the blue dress Mom had bought me just a month before, wondering if she would suddenly appear and explain everything. But she never did. Dad gripped my hand so tightly it hurt as we left the courthouse. "She's a traitor," he spat, his jaw clenched. "We don't need her. We never needed her." But I did need her. I needed my mom to protect me from Dad's temper, to braid my hair in the mornings, to tell me everything would be okay. Instead, I was left alone with a father whose anger now had no other target but me. That's when Dad decided to hire a nanny. "I can't work and take care of a child," he announced one evening. "We need help around here." Enter Maria Chen, young, pretty, and at first, seemingly perfect. She was 26, had a degree in early childhood education, and made the best chocolate chip cookies I'd ever tasted. When she started working for us, I thought things might finally get better. At first, I didn't understand what was happening. Dad and Maria would exchange these weird little smiles when they thought I wasn't looking. Sometimes I'd walk into a room and they'd suddenly stop talking, like teenagers caught passing notes in class. Maria started staying later and later after Dad got home from work, and they'd sit in the kitchen talking in low voices. One evening in October, about 6 months after Maria started working for us, Dad called me into his study. Maria was there too, standing next to his desk with this huge smile on her face. "Elsie," Dad said, actually looking happy for the first time since Mom left, "I have something important to tell you. Maria and I are getting married." I remember feeling relieved, honestly. Maria had been so good to me. She helped me with my homework, made my favorite pasta dishes, and never yelled like Dad did. When I had nightmares, she'd sit with me and tell me stories until I fell back asleep. Maybe this was our chance at being a real family again. "That's great," I said, and I meant it. Maria hugged me, and her perfume smelled like vanilla and flowers. "We'll be so happy together," she promised. "You'll see." The wedding was small but elegant. I was the flower girl, wearing a pink dress that Maria helped me pick out. She looked beautiful in her white gown, and Dad couldn't stop smiling. That was the last day I saw the Maria I knew. It started small. The day after they got back from their honeymoon, I left my backpack in the living room like I always did. Maria walked in, saw it, and her whole face changed. "Pick that up immediately," she snapped. "This isn't a pigsty." I was shocked. Maria had never spoken to me like that before. But that was just the beginning. Suddenly, everything I did was wrong. My bed wasn't made properly. I was too loud when I walked. I didn't say please and thank you enough times. One day, confused and hurt by her complete transformation, I worked up the courage to ask her directly, "Why are you so different now? You used to be so nice to me." Maria laughed, not the warm laugh I remembered, but something cold and sharp. "Oh, sweetie," she said, examining her perfectly manicured nails, "before, I was just an employee. Now I'm the lady of this house, and you need to learn your place. When I tell you to do something, you do it. No questions asked." I ran to Dad's study that evening, tears streaming down my face, and told him everything. I thought he would protect me, set things right. Instead, his face turned that dangerous shade of red I remembered from his fights with Mom. "You're just like your mother," he snarled, slamming his hand on the desk. "Always complaining, always causing problems. Let me make something very clear. If I hear you saying one more word against Maria to anyone, you'll be very, very sorry. Do you understand me?" I nodded, my whole body shaking, and fled to my room. That night, I cried into my pillow until it was soaked through, wishing desperately for Mom to come back and save me. Life became a minefield of new rules and restrictions. Maria wielded her authority like a weapon, finding new ways to make my life miserable every day. First, she banned my favorite pop music because it was too vulgar. Then she took away the small TV in my room, claiming it was distracting me from my studies, even though I had straight A's. She started controlling what I wore, throwing out my favorite jeans because they were too casual. My colorful bedspread was replaced with plain white sheets because my room needed to match the house aesthetic. She even scheduled my shower times, no longer than 10 minutes, and only at specific hours she approved. The only light in this darkness was Grandma Helen, Mom's mother. She visited every few weeks, always bringing me something special: books, clothes, or little pieces of jewelry that Maria couldn't justify taking away because they were family gifts. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" Grandma would ask during her visits, her eyes searching my face for the truth. I'd feel Dad's and Maria's eyes on me, remember Dad's threat, and force a smile. "I'm fine, Grandma, everything's great." This went on for 3 years. I learned to live by Maria's rules, to stay quiet, to be invisible. Then, when I was 13, Maria announced she was pregnant. Dad was ecstatic. He started converting the guest room into a nursery before she was even showing. Maria spent hours looking at baby clothes and designing the perfect room for their precious daughter. When little Sophie was born, it was like I ceased to exist entirely. Dad took photos of everything she did: her first smile, her first attempt to roll over, her first grab at a toy. Maria posted hourly updates on social media about her perfect little angel. But 6 months into their parental bliss, Maria started complaining. "I'm so exhausted," she'd whine to Dad. "The baby needs constant attention. I can't even get my nails done anymore." Dad, ever the problem solver, suggested hiring a babysitter. "There are plenty of qualified college students looking for work," he said one evening over dinner. "We could interview some." I watched Maria's face twist into a grimace at the mention of college students. Her hand tightened around her fork, and I could practically read her thoughts. After all, wasn't that exactly how she'd gotten her position in this house? A young, pretty student nanny who ended up becoming the wife? The irony wasn't lost on me, even at 13. "Absolutely not," Maria cut him off, her fork clattering against her plate. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at me across the table. "We don't need to hire anyone. We have a perfectly capable babysitter right here." Dad followed her gaze and nodded slowly. "You're right. Elsie can help out with Sophie. It'll be good for her to learn some responsibility." What started as helping out quickly turned into full-time, unpaid childcare. Every day after school, Maria would be waiting by the door, Sophie already in her arms. The moment I stepped inside, she'd practically throw the baby at me. "She's been fed, but she'll need changing soon," Maria would say, already grabbing her designer purse. "I have an appointment at the salon," or "I'm meeting the girls for coffee," or whatever excuse she had that day. I loved Sophie. She was an innocent baby who didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of all this. But I was 14, trying to maintain my grades while essentially becoming a full-time nanny. Instead of doing my algebra homework, I was warming bottles and making baby food. Rather than working on my history project, I was changing diapers and singing lullabies. Maria would breeze in around 6:30, just before Dad got home, carrying takeout containers from expensive restaurants. "I'm exhausted from cooking all day," she'd announce as Dad walked in, setting the food on the table. I'd be there, still in my school uniform, Sophie on my hip, homework untouched. One day at school, I couldn't take it anymore. During lunch, I broke down and told my friend Amanda everything, about being forced to watch Sophie every day, about not having time for homework, about Maria's lies to Dad. "That's not right," Amanda said, her face serious. "My mom works for Child Protective Services. This is exactly the kind of thing she deals with. I should have known better than to trust anyone." 2 days later, I was home with Sophie, trying to simultaneously feed her strained peas and read my English assignment, when there was a knock at the door. 3 people in professional attire introduced themselves as representatives from CPS. They asked where Maria was. I told the truth, at her weekly spa appointment. They looked around the house, took notes, asked me questions about my daily routine. Then they called my father. Dad arrived 20 minutes later, his face a mask of calm that didn't reach his eyes. I knew that look. It was the same one he used to wear before his worst fights with Mom. The CPS workers explained their concerns about leaving a 14-year-old in charge of an infant for extended periods. They issued a formal warning about negligent supervision and left their card. The moment their car pulled away, Dad exploded. "You treacherous little snake," he roared, his face purple with rage. "Just like your mother, always trying to destroy this family. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I didn't mean to," I started, but he cut me off. "Shut up. You're exactly like her, a traitor. You betrayed this family, betrayed Maria's trust." Maria came home then, her hair freshly styled, nails gleaming. Dad told her everything, but remarkably, his anger never touched her. Instead, she burst into tears, claiming I was trying to ruin her life, that I was jealous of her relationship with Sophie, that I was ungrateful for everything they'd done for me. "Go to your room," Dad bellowed. "No phone, no computer, no leaving the house except for school for the next month. And if you ever pull something like this again." He didn't finish the threat. He didn't need to. A week after the CPS incident, I waited until Dad and Maria were asleep, then crept downstairs with my phone that they'd forgotten to take away. My hands were shaking as I dialed Grandma Helen's number. "Grandma?" I whispered when she answered. "I need help." My voice broke as I told her everything, the forced babysitting, the neglect, Dad's rage, the punishment. She listened quietly, only occasionally making soft sounds of distress. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," she said firmly. "Pack a bag, sweetheart, just in case." True to her word, Grandma Helen arrived at 9 a.m. sharp the next day. She wasn't her usual diplomatic self. She stormed into the house like an avenging angel, her normally perfect hair slightly disheveled, her eyes blazing. "I've watched this situation long enough," she announced to Dad and Maria in our living room. "I know everything, how you've turned my granddaughter into an unpaid servant, how you've been neglecting her education, how you punish her for speaking the truth." Dad started to protest, but Grandma cut him off. "I'm taking Elsie to live with me. You can either agree to this amicably, or we can let a judge decide after I show them the evidence I've been collecting." "You can't just take her," Dad spluttered, but I noticed Maria's expression shift. She touched Dad's arm gently. "Maybe," she said softly, "maybe it would be better for everyone. We could focus on Sophie, and Elsie would have more opportunities with Helen." I could see the wheels turning in Dad's head as Maria continued to whisper persuasively in his ear. Within an hour, he agreed to let me go. Grandma's house, or rather, mansion, was like something out of a dream. Located in the wealthy part of town, it had a sweeping driveway, manicured gardens, and more rooms than I could count. My bedroom was bigger than our entire living room at Dad's house, with a window seat overlooking the rose garden. "This is your home now," Grandma said, helping me unpack. "You can decorate it however you like." I transferred to Winchester Prep, where I quickly made real friends for the first time in years. No one there knew my history, and I could just be myself, not the unwanted stepdaughter, not the unpaid babysitter, just Elsie. On my 16th birthday, Grandma called me into her study. She was sitting behind her antique desk, looking more serious than usual. "I've set up a college fund for you," she announced. "It should cover tuition at any university you choose, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, wherever you want to go." That night, I stayed up late studying for my AP biology test. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just studying to escape my reality, I was studying for my future. I found the photo album by accident while helping Grandma reorganize her office a month after the conversation about college. It was leather-bound, tucked away on a high shelf, behind some financial records. When I opened it, my mother's face stared back at me, younger, happier, in pictures I'd never seen before. My heart started racing as I flipped through the pages. There she was at my age, then at her high school graduation, then at what looked like her college years. She looked so much like me, it was startling. The same dark hair, the same smile, even the same way of tilting her head in photos. "Grandma," I called out, my voice trembling with sudden hope. "Look what I found." Grandma came into the office and froze when she saw what I was holding. "We should contact her," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Now that I'm living with you, Dad can't stop her from seeing me anymore." "She doesn't have to be afraid of him. We could." "Elsie," Grandma interrupted softly, and something in her tone made my stomach drop. "There's something you need to know." She walked to her desk and opened her laptop, clicking through folders until she found what she was looking for. "I should have told you this sooner, but I was trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" Grandma took a deep breath. "The day after your mother left, I emailed her. I knew where she was, she'd contacted me briefly before leaving. I told her she needed to come back for you, that she couldn't leave you with your father. I promised to help her financially, to support both of you, to do whatever was necessary to keep you both safe." My hands were shaking now. What did she say?" Instead of answering, Grandma turned the laptop toward me. The email was dated one day after Mom left, and it was short. "Mom, don't contact me about Elsie again. I don't want her. I never have. I never loved her, she was just a chain keeping me tied to that house, to that life. I don't care what happens to her. She's Robert's problem now. Sarah." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I read it again and again, trying to make them say something different. But they remained the same, cold, cruel, final. "I saved it," Grandma said quietly. "I thought someday you might need to know the truth." I closed the photo album slowly, my mother's smiling face suddenly seeming like a mockery. All these years, I'd imagined her forced away by Dad's cruelty, too afraid to contact me, perhaps watching me from afar and loving me in secret. But the truth was simpler and far more brutal, she'd never wanted me at all. The next 2 years were the happiest of my life. I got accepted to Princeton with a perfect GPA and spent my weekdays immersed in my studies, making new friends, and building a life for myself. Every weekend, I'd call Grandma Helen, and during holidays and vacations, I'd return home to her. "Tell me everything," she'd say as we shared tea in her garden, and I'd talk for hours about my classes, my friends, my dreams for the future. Then, halfway through my sophomore year, Grandma got sick. It started with what seemed like a simple cold, but quickly turned into something much worse. The doctors discovered stage 4 lung cancer, already spread throughout her body. They gave her 6 months. She fought hard, never losing her dignity or her sharp wit, but the doctors were right. I spent that summer break by her bedside, watching her slip away. She died on a quiet Tuesday morning in August, holding my hand and telling me how proud she was of me. The funeral was well attended. Grandma Helen had been a pillar of the community, and people came from all over to pay their respects. Business associates, charity board members, friends from her social clubs, distant relatives I barely knew, they all came to say goodbye. But 3 people were conspicuously absent: my mother, my father, and Maria. Not that I expected them to come, but their absence felt like one final confirmation of how completely they'd cut themselves out of our lives. 2 weeks after the funeral, I received a call from Mr. Patterson, Grandma's notary, asking me to come to his office for the reading of the will. When I arrived, I found someone I hadn't seen in over a decade: my mother. She was with a man who looked about 5 years younger than her, dressed in an expensive but ill-fitting suit. She barely glanced at me when I walked in, though I caught her checking her watch repeatedly as she urged Mr. Patterson to get on with it. The reading itself was brief but devastating, at least for her. Grandma had left me her house, all her jewelry, and the bulk of her fortune, $700,000. My mother received $100,000 and nothing else. This can't be right, my mother burst out, her composure finally cracking. Tears streamed down her face, smearing her perfect makeup. I'm her daughter. I have debts to pay. I need that money. The younger man with her shifted uncomfortably in his chair as she continued to sob and plead, claiming she was entitled to more, that it wasn't fair, that she needed help. I stood up without a word and walked out, her cries following me down the hallway. The next morning, I was in Grandma's study, my study now, sorting through decades of documents. The doorbell rang around noon. When I opened the door, my mother stood there, wearing a different designer outfit than yesterday, but the same desperate expression. She walked past me into the foyer, her eyes drinking in every detail of the house. Oh, it's exactly as I remember it. I grew up here, you know. That chip in the marble by the stairs? That's from when I was 7 and dropped my roller skates. Why are you here? I asked, closing the door but not moving from it. She ran her hand along the banister. I miss this place, miss you. We have so much catching up to do, don't you think? Mother and daughter, finally reunited. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. 12 years. It took you 12 years to miss me? I know I made mistakes, she said, her voice taking on a pleading tone. I was young, trapped in a horrible marriage with your father. I wasn't thinking clearly. She moved into the living room, settling onto the couch as if she belonged there. Actually, sweetie, I was hoping we could help each other out. I'm in a bit of a financial bind right now, and this house is so big for just one person. No, I said firmly. You can't live here. Not now, not ever. Her face changed then, the mask of maternal affection slipping. I'm your mother, Elsie, you can't just throw me out on the street. I gave birth to you. And then you abandoned me, I replied, my voice steady. You left me with a father you knew was toxic. You never called, never wrote, never checked if I was okay. She paled slightly but recovered quickly. You don't understand how complicated adult relationships are. If you turn your back on me now, I'll make sure everyone knows what a cruel, heartless daughter you are. I'll tell them how you're leaving your own mother homeless. I walked to the study, retrieved my laptop, and returned. Go ahead, tell everyone. And I'll show them this. I opened the saved email, the one Grandma had kept all these years. I don't want her. I never have. I never loved her, I read aloud. She's Robert's problem now. Should I forward this to all those society friends you're so worried about? Post it on social media maybe? The color drained from her face completely. She stood up, grabbing her designer purse. You're just like your father, cruel and manipulative. No, I said calmly. I'm like my grandmother, I see through your act, and I keep receipts. She fled the house in a rage, the door slamming behind her. That was 6 months ago. I'm graduating from Princeton next month, with honors in business administration. I've already accepted a job offer at a consulting firm in town, and in July, I'll move back into Grandma's house permanently. My house now. Dad tried to call once, probably after hearing about the inheritance from my mother. I didn't answer. Maria still posts perfect family photos with Sophie on social media. I blocked her account. My mother occasionally sends manipulative texts about forgiveness and family obligations. I blocked her number too. Some people say you can't choose your family, but I disagree. Grandma chose me when my own parents wouldn't, and that's the legacy I'm choosing to honor. I'm having the house renovated next month, updating it while keeping all the things that made it special to Grandma. Yesterday, I found a letter Grandma had written to me before she died, tucked away in her desk drawer. Remember, she wrote, your worth isn't determined by those who left, but by how you choose to move forward. You are stronger than you know, smarter than you believe, and more loved than you can imagine. She was right. The past is the past, and I'm done letting it define my future.
The thought that my mother-in-law won't be around for much longer is a comfort. I took some paid time off to spend a night away from the house where I live with my in-laws to attend my youngest brother's wedding. As I packed my overnight bag, my mother-in-law's voice called out after me, "Why don't you just never come back? And while you're at it, why don't you get a divorce and leave?" I smiled subtly, accepting her malice, and left the house without looking back. I paused to say goodbye to our house before going too far. I appreciated everything it had done for me despite my mother-in-law's lack of attention. Carrying a somewhat large bag, I hurried to the location where my dear family awaited. The hotel would be my home for 3 days and 2 nights, and my mother-in-law had no idea I wouldn't be returning. What happens next is still a secret. I'm Selena Jason, a 48-year-old part-time employee, balancing the management of our hectic home with my office work. Dean and I have been married for over 30 years. Despite our arranged marriage, we get along well and share similar values. The only challenge in our relationship is Dean's career as a sailor, which often keeps him away for over a year at a time. We are blessed with a son, and our connection remains strong. Until recently, we lived with my in-laws, primarily caring for Dean's grandmother. I manage her care almost entirely on my own, paying a caretaker during the day. This arrangement continued until her passing. Tears filled my eyes as Dean expressed his gratitude for the attention I gave her. She spent her last years surrounded by great-grandchildren and received excellent care. Though Dean's profession keeps him away, I'm proud of his significant contributions to American logistics. After her grandmother's death, my mother-in-law's behavior changed drastically. She once tried to be kind to me while pushing all the caregiving duties onto me, but once I stopped, she began to completely disregard me. She would exclude me from outings and intentionally bump into me within the home. Her blatant hostility was unsettling. During one of Dean's absences, my son Russell mentioned, "Grandma's saying nasty things again." When Russell was only 4 or 5, my mother-in-law made up stories to convince him that my father hated me and that I was cheating on Dean, which she claimed was why Dean didn't come home. Discovering these falsehoods left me astounded. I was diligently doing domestic tasks and working hard every day, not cheating. Dean's absences were due to his job, not my actions. Convincing a child of such lies was absurd. I focused on calming a worried Russell rather than dwelling on her words. I was relieved when Dean returned and reprimanded her for her behavior. Now that Dean is back, my mother-in-law seems to be making the most of his presence by keeping me busy. Despite the caregiving being over, she insists on meticulous cleaning and gives me difficult recipes to follow. Recently, she hosted a drama marathon, inviting local ladies over, leaving a mess of drink spills and food wrappers for me to clean up. It added more work during an already hectic time before dinner. I was sweating from the cleanup, irritated by her constant demands to hurry up and make supper. She claimed to be too full from snacks, but didn't even sit at the table for dinner. Russell's complaint that my mother-in-law said she didn't like me and that I should go away only made me more irate. He suggested it might be best if we lived apart from her. After calming down Russell and preparing him for bed, I knew I needed to have a serious conversation with Dean. One day, after Russell left, I suddenly started to feel sick. I was sweating, my face was hot, and my limbs were freezing. My menopausal symptoms were especially bad on that specific day. Since last year, I've been feeling strange, and the doctors have determined that it's menopause. They were monitoring my condition without prescribing anything, but there were difficult days. I questioned if the stress from my mother-in-law's actions was affecting my health. By nightfall, I felt worse and found myself resting in my room. My mother-in-law was yelling at me to come to supper as I heard her approaching. I was having trouble simply sitting up. I thought about pretending to be asleep, but she pulled the cover off me. She clapped her hands and demanded supper, so I reluctantly sat up. Given that my grandmother-in-law used to manage the kitchen, I reasoned that if my mother-in-law wanted supper, she should prepare it herself. Lately, it had just been me in the kitchen. My mother-in-law hardly ever went in there except to set the dishes while Dean was home. Maybe she wasn't a good chef. I told her I was having trouble with menopause and couldn't do the chores today since I was so tired. Having experienced menopausal symptoms herself, I thought she would understand. Her response, though, was far from empathetic. She snorted, turned a sack over my head, and I screamed a little in the darkened room as things fell down around me. I was nauseous after waking up but wasn't sure why right away. A minute later, I discovered the fragrance surrounding me was that of potatoes. My mother-in-law had thrown snack crumbs all over me, and the bag she'd have flipped upside down was almost empty. It was so unexpected that I was taken aback. With a tongue click, she exited the room. I lay in bed, hurting, reprimanded, and drenched in crumbs. Rather than being angry, I experienced an odd, almost dreamlike feeling, as though I was seeing something peculiar. My patience was beginning to wear thin. I took a paid leave of absence from work about 6 months later to prepare for a trip to my younger brother's wedding. After living together for a few years, he was finally getting married to his girlfriend. Their house is in New York, so I made reservations for a 3-day, 2-night stay at a hotel. Despite my brother's offer to pay, I chose to handle the hotel expenses myself since I wanted to set my own hours. Although it was a modest ceremony with just relatives, I was looking forward to attending because it was a rare opportunity for everyone to be together. I planned a week's worth of meals ahead of time, figuring no one else would be cooking during my vacation. I told my in-laws about the meals I had made and put in the fridge the evening before I left. During supper, my mother-in-law appeared unhappy, but my father-in-law praised me. "What's the deal with all the fuss? It's your brother's wedding. Why even attend? Isn't this simply a remarriage? Probably nothing noteworthy," she scowled, more than just a stare. My father-in-law gave her a look. "Actually, both my brother and his partner are getting married for the first time," I corrected her. My mother-in-law seemed to be misinterpreting the situation as she laughed crudely. "A first marriage at 40 must indicate a personal issue with him. Even though your brother is young, why is he getting married in style?" "Insolent," she said. It seemed she had either forgotten my family structure or was mistaking my brother for someone else. In reality, I have 3 brothers, and my youngest brother is still very young. Considering we are separated by 14 years, my youngest brother, who is in his early 30s, is marrying a woman in her 20s. My mother-in-law was insulted by the correction when I told her this. Her next statement was even more snide, comparing the age difference between a parent and child to that of a girlfriend in her 20s. It surprised me that she wouldn't listen. My father-in-law cleared his throat as if he realized what had happened. "She's not just 20, she's in her 20s, I attempted to explain. Their ages barely differ by 4 or 5 years. That seems sensible, doesn't it?" She appeared rather reasonable when we chatted on a video conference. Lately, I wrapped up my conversation with my in-laws and got ready to head out. I made sure I had everything I needed in my bag and prepared a gorgeous attire for the wedding. From the living room, I could hear my mother-in-law speaking loudly and angrily to my father-in-law. Knowing it would be best to avoid any confrontation, I decided to leave the house as quickly as possible. Feeling a surge of anger, I rolled my somewhat overweight bag towards the front entrance. The following morning, I was briefly stopped by my mother-in-law's parting remarks. "Never come back, and why don't you just get a divorce?" "Yes, as you wish," I replied happily, sounding more composed than I had anticipated. I had long since reached my breaking point and felt more relieved than I realized. Dean had helped me prepare for this day. My mother-in-law laughed and munched on some snacks, seemingly oblivious to the circumstances. The amount of food she could consume first thing in the morning surprised me. I chose to walk to the station. As I turned to look back at the house before continuing, I thought I really owe this house a lot, except for my mother-in-law. For a very long time, Dean, Russell, my father-in-law, and my grandmother-in-law had made this house feel like home. I even felt like I owed the walls and roof. But I didn't remember ever needing my mother-in-law's assistance. I felt so silly for some reason. With somewhat excessive luggage, I hastened to meet my dear family. I was about to move into a new apartment and live alone after spending 3 days and 2 nights at a motel. I met Dean at the wedding location. He was the one we had invited, and when he saw me coming, he handed me a pen and an unsigned divorce document. We decided that signing it would be the last thing we did together as a couple. Many thanks. Together. Let's complete it when we return to the hotel. I hope it's acceptable that I reserved a twin room, I added. My brother's marriage today is a sad event but also represents a fresh start for us. We'll disclose the divorce later and not in front of everyone today. Dean and I exchanged a warm smile, both of us realizing the momentous step we were about to take. It seemed so weighty to even consider signing that one piece of paper, representing the dissolution of our more than 30-year marriage. Dean comforted me, saying that being with him had always made me truly happy, so I apologized. I didn't mind that he was frequently away from home for work because I knew this from the beginning. Well, except for his mother. Apologize not. You've made a fantastic spouse, I added. Let's stay close friends moving forward. With all the affection I could muster, Dean clasped my hand in tears and thanked me once again, bringing tears to my eyes as well. I decided to blame my emotions on joy for my brother's wedding. Dean went back to his parents' house by himself the following day. He gave his in-laws an explanation of the circumstances, and at first, they were taken aback by the abrupt discussion of divorce. When they heard the whole tale, my father-in-law lost his temper. He yelled, frightening my mother-in-law, "How dare you drive out someone who cared for my mother until the end?" My father-in-law had been a great support and caring partner, even though I had been the one doing most of the physical labor and taking care of my grandmother-in-law. It seems that my father-in-law had secretly grumbled about my mother-in-law's lack of contribution. He went up to her and voiced his complaints. "Since entering the family through marriage, you have never been good at cleaning. You gave birth to our baby, so I remained mute. However, you have taken advantage of my mother's indulgence to avoid lending a hand. Selena accomplished everything. You're nothing like her," he said. The comparison to me made him even more enraged. "You ought to have been the one to depart. It is incomprehensible that we lost a devoted daughter-in-law like Selena who gave us so much. You have made no financial contribution at all." My mother-in-law's stance was undermined when money was brought up. Dean's pay covered all family costs, and she had never worked outside the home. Even though our family was wealthy, I continued to work because I enjoyed it. My income supported the family by paying for theater tickets, vacations, and special occasion fine meals. These actions were investments in getting me some alone time. "Dean, it's not too late." Seeing the seriousness of the situation, my father-in-law at last advised, "Go apologize and ask Selena to marry you again." Despite her distress and desperation, my mother-in-law was powerless to avert the fallout from her actions. "This is the home I constructed," my father-in-law furiously said. "You need to leave," and he started to evict her. In a fit of rage, my mother-in-law screamed and scratched at her tangled hair. Observers found her conduct strange and disturbing. "No, I'm not going anywhere. I refuse to be divorced at this age. How am I meant to live alone?" she said. My father-in-law was physically stronger than her, so he ultimately succeeded in dragging her out of the house despite her struggle. He forcefully closed and locked the door, leaving her to sob loudly, clutching it. The neighbors were frightened by the disturbance and phoned the police. When the police came, my father-in-law opened the door, but his rage lingered for several days. The atmosphere in the house was tense. My father-in-law and mother-in-law avoided one another and even ran away when they saw each other in the same room. It was as though they were living apart. My father-in-law called a family gathering after his distant daughter was put in an unsustainable circumstance. He said, "I'm going to divorce her," but his daughter objected, expressing compassion for my mother-in-law, which made things more difficult to talk about. Dean described the abuse I was subjected to, including the way my mother-in-law had deceived our kid to incite him against me. He talked about my menopausal pain and showed emails from our kid as proof. Having seen it all, my father-in-law voiced his dissatisfaction, saying my mother-in-law had disobeyed his advice to halt her actions and apologize. Dean also brought up how I handled home duties and my grandmother-in-law's care, asking his sister what she would think if her own mother-in-law had acted in the same way. She remained mute when asked which side she would support. Enraged, my mother-in-law bemoaned that her daughter had betrayed her and claimed to have betrayed herself. Her sardonic honesty amused me since, as I discovered, our grandmother was the one who raised us most of the time, something I had always worried about in our family. Mom used to spend a lot of time with her neighbors, chatting about her old days. His sister had looked at my mother-in-law with contempt after learning about the bullying. Ultimately, the only housewives who made a significant contribution were myself and my grandmother-in-law, whom I took care of until her death. Despite having 2 kids, my mother-in-law often shied away from cleaning and took pleasure in the advantages with little effort. Her status was undermined when the family ultimately discovered her pattern of carelessness. My mother-in-law halted her tirades, realized her situation, and started crying. Ultimately, compassion prevented a divorce, but my father-in-law is still considering it. I told my father-in-law that I would want to meet with him when I heard this. After I left, Dean told me about these incidents. He said, "Dad should have supported Selena from the beginning if he was going to get so upset now. However, I wasn't present, so what could I say?" Sipping his steaming coffee, Dean moaned. We were in our beloved cafe, a spot we have loved since we were little. I selected a soft drink, something I hadn't had in a while, whereas Dean got a coffee. I grinned softly as I heard the specifics of my mother-in-law's shameful actions. "Be kind to yourself. Your crucial work required you to be gone. You are relied upon by many," I said sincerely. It is wonderful that Dean, while being gone for years at a time, supports people via marine transportation in his capacity as a sailor. I apologize for this inconvenience, but that's why I've been putting up with it. You have my continued admiration and respect, yet I am unable to stay in your parents' household. At last I said what had been on my mind for a very long time. Though he seemed a little dejected, Dean nodded in agreement. I was relieved that he did not blindly support his parents. I couldn't help but grin widely, and Dean gave me an obviously amazed look. Dean later said that he believed my smile was brighter than it had ever been at that very time. Dean also seemed more endearing than ever to me. Dean assisted me in seeing his father the day following our cafe meeting. It was time for my last bit of retaliation. Dean's father was dressed more elegantly than usual when he showed up at the cafe. I briefly discussed the weather before getting right to the point. "Dean told me that you're thinking about divorcing your wife. It's doable while you're still well. But after all this chaos, managing it on your own will be difficult. I'm willing to assist with your latter years of care if you do decide to split." This obviously thrilled his father. Dean could spend a lot of time at sea, and his sister resided far away. He had never been one to help out around the house with cooking, cleaning, or washing, so after seeing his mother through to the end, he would definitely be grateful for my assistance. He crossed his arms and scowled, saying, "Of course I'll separate from her." No, hold on, perhaps getting a divorce would be better. I hoped my mother-in-law would be fully removed from the matter since she was quite likely to be removed. Her circumstances looked to be getting worse. If I were to suddenly pass away, she'd probably make a huge fuss, he thought. It's better to divorce her properly before that happens. Dean seemed to steel himself as his father talked with increasing determination. Once he makes up his mind, his father usually follows through on it, sometimes going a little too far, but that's just his personality. After years of cohabiting with him, I smiled and nodded in accord, knowing how to handle him. This kind of little prodding would probably get him to follow through. Dean laughed and saw what I was trying to do but didn't step in. He appeared to be much more irritated than I was by my mother-in-law's actions. Suddenly full of energy, his father sprang up to get the divorce papers. I chose to help him out of goodwill by introducing him to the attorney Dean, and I had consulted for our divorce. My mother-in-law was doomed to live a lonely existence after that day since my father-in-law aggressively pursued the divorce. After a week, I went back to my old house, which was now simply my ex-in-law's place. I went to get possessions that I had previously been unable to take. Even though I had removed most of the items, there were still clothing, books, sentimental mementos, drawings from my son's early years, bedding and furniture that I had paid for with my own money. I had gathered a lot of personal belongings in the residence over the years. I ended up seeing my mother-in-law for the last time on this visit. She was clearly in a panic, as her divorce had already been settled by that point. She knelt in front of me as I collected my possessions, her face pale, and she started apologizing. "Margaret, I sincerely apologize. I ask you please, it was a joke. Kindly return and convince your spouse," she pleaded. I ignored my mother-in-law's pleadings and kept packing. She got to her feet quickly, insulting me and going back to her old ways, furious at my lack of interest. "How can you disregard me when I'm acting so modestly? Since being a member of this family, you have only caused problems. Simply depart and pass away by yourself," she screamed. He barked and spat at me after hurling a string of less complex, unrepeatable slurs. I ignored her again and concentrated on putting my belongings in a cardboard box. She let out a sudden cry and rushed towards the box, turning it over. Startled, I ducked as she had a fit, kicking and stomping the clothing, scattering them across the floor. "Enough?" Dean scowled at his mother and yelled. His normally submissive nature had grown into a powerful figure, surprising his mother despite his habit of complying. I turned to my mother-in-law and held Dean back with one hand while maintaining a neutral look. "I am not your daughter-in-law anymore. You are not my mother-in-law anymore. We are no longer in a relationship. I'm grateful for nothing. It was not you but your father-in-law and grandmother that assisted me." I hurried over the jumbled garments and stuffed them into the box without folding any of them. "Strange, don't touch my belongings." "Farewell," I said, directing a final remark at my messy mother-in-law. I hurried out of the room, ready to be away from her. I gave Dean a call to take care of the stuff that was left. I waited for my brother to go after getting into his car. My mother-in-law was still screaming inside the home, but I wasn't going to waste time listening. I heard her weep in sorrow and keep beating her own head after we departed. She appeared to regret cutting off her final hope, but there was never going to be a possibility for reconciliation. Sadly, it was too late for her regrets to be significant. My mother-in-law was ultimately forced to move out and started living alone in a small apartment about a month later. Every now and again, Dean and his sister stop over to see how she's doing. I've heard that she resides indoors most of the time, hardly takes a shower, and wears her old clothing as pajamas. She spends her days eating cheap snacks and fast food and complaining about how poor her life is. Even though she and my father-in-law divided some assets during the divorce, it wasn't much, which meant she would be financially unstable as she aged. Personally, I'm not offering any assistance. Is that not evident? Dean's mother was always proud of him because he was a well-paid sailor. It never occurred to her that her own kid might cut her off altogether. Ironically, she is now the one who is unable to return, despite having previously advised me to leave and obtain a divorce. Similar to the proverb, curses return upon those who curse, my mother-in-law ought to have been prepared to deal with her own bad luck if she cast bad luck wishes on other people. I live a quiet life with my cat in an apartment approximately 30 minutes away from my former in-law's house. 5 years after the divorce, I chose this location since it would make my commute to work easier. The rental is a nice property with plenty of sunlight and is pet-friendly. Every week, I still go see my ex-father-in-law and make him different meals. Since the divorce, our relationship seems to have improved. Considering how much I still assist, my distant sister-in-law can scarcely meet my sight. Dean and I communicate frequently. We make it a point to go on dates as soon as he gets back from his lengthy maritime travels. It's like opening a fresh chapter. Though we are relatively new to this, we like going to movies and museums, and our relationship seems new and exciting. We find it quite delightful to talk and communicate for hours on end. On his days off, Russell comes over to visit and makes jokes about our fake divorce, joking, "You two just went back to being lovers, didn't you?" However, the fact is that Dean and I never had a romantic relationship in the first place. Our marriage was planned. We seem to be developing a love relationship for the first time right now. We even have a cover agreement that says we will remarry if we are ever totally free from his mother, whether she dies, moves in with his sister, or enters a facility. Dean proposes that this would be the point at which his mother would no longer require welfare checks. Talks have already started on whether his sister and her husband would put her in a facility or begin living with her. Our get-together could not be too far off. It seems a little awkward to discuss, but after more than 30 years together, And as we approach our 50s, I'm excited about the possibility of falling in love with Dean, for whom I've always had a great deal of affection. The knife sliced through the air, missing my ear by a hair's breadth. I froze, my heart pounding as I stared at my mother-in-law, Jane, who stood there with a maniacal grin, brandishing the cake knife like a weapon. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Ava dear," she cooed, her voice dripping with false sweetness. My hand must have slipped. "Here, let me cut you a slice of cake." Cake. I stepped back, my hands trembling. "No thank you, Jane. I think I've lost my appetite." Matthew, my husband, rushed to my side. "Mom, what the hell? You could have hurt Ava." Jane's face crumpled into a mask of innocence. "Oh, Matthew, don't be silly. It was an accident. Ava knows I'd never hurt her intentionally, don't you, dear?" I bit my tongue, fighting the urge to scream. This was supposed to be a joyous family gathering to celebrate Matthew's promotion, but leave it to Jane to turn it into a nightmare. "I think we should go," I whispered to Matthew, tugging at his sleeve. He nodded, his jaw clenched. "Yeah, I think that's best. Dad, we're heading out." George, Matthew's father, looked up from his plate, bewildered. "But you've barely touched your food. What's the rush?" "Ask your wife," Matthew snapped, grabbing our coats. As we made our way to the door, Jane's saccharine voice followed us. "Leaving so soon? But I made your favorite dessert, Matthew. Don't you want to stay?" I could see the conflict in Matthew's eyes. He loved his mother despite her quirks, but he loved me too, and I knew he was torn. "We'll take some to go, Mom," he said finally, his voice strained. Jane's eyes narrowed, but she plastered on a smile. "Of course, darling. Let me wrap that up for you." As she disappeared into the kitchen, I turned to Matthew. "We can't keep doing this," I hissed. "Your mother is out of control." He ran a hand through his hair, sighing. I know. But what can I do? She's my mother." "She's a menace," I retorted. "And if we don't do something, she's going to destroy our marriage." Before Matthew could respond, Jane reappeared, holding a Tupperware container. "Here you go, sweetie. I made sure to give you an extra large piece." As Matthew took the container, Jane's eyes locked with mine, the hatred in her gaze unmistakable. "Drive safe now," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "And Ava dear, do try to be more careful around sharp objects. We wouldn't want any accidents." I felt a chill run down my spine as we left the house. In the car, I turned to Matthew. "You heard that, right? That wasn't just me." He sighed, starting the engine. "I heard it. Look, I'll talk to her, okay? She'll come around eventually." I snorted. "Yeah, right? And pigs might fly." As we drove home in tense silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Jane had always disliked me, but tonight felt different, more dangerous. I glanced at the Tupperware container on my lap, suddenly suspicious. "Matthew, pull over." "What? Why?" "Just do it." He complied, and I got out of the car, opening the container. The smell hit me first, acrid and wrong. I dumped the contents onto the grass and gasped. "Matthew, look at this." He came around the car, his eyes widening as he saw the cake. It was laced with something, tiny white crystals that definitely weren't sugar. "Oh my God," he whispered. "She wouldn't?" But we both knew the truth. Jane had crossed the line, and there was no going back. As we stood there staring at the tainted cake in the moonlight, I knew our lives would never be the same. The war with Jane had begun, and I was determined to win, no matter the cost. I stared at the photo album, my fingers tracing the edges of a picture from 5 years ago. There I was, beamy in my white dress, Matthew at my side, and there, just behind us, was Jane, her smile as brittle as glass. "Penny for your thoughts?" Matthew's voice startled me from my reverie. I snapped the album shut, just remembering the day I met your mother. God, I was so naive. Matthew sighed, settling beside me on the couch. "You couldn't have known, Ava. None of us did. But I should have. The signs were there from the very beginning." I closed my eyes, remembering that fateful day 5 years ago. Matthew and I had just gotten engaged and were heading to his parents' house for dinner. I was nervous, eager to make a good impression. Jane had opened the door, her perfectly coiffed hair and immaculate outfit making me feel underdressed in my work clothes. "You must be Ava," she'd said, her eyes sweeping over me critically. "I thought you'd be taller." I'd laughed it off then, chalking it up to nerves. But as the evening wore on, Jane's barbs became sharper, more pointed. "So, Ava," she'd said over dessert, "Matthew tells me you're quite career-focused. I do hope you'll find time for a family. A woman's most important job is being a mother, after all." I'd nearly choked on my coffee. "Well, I believe a woman can have both a career and a family," I'd replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Jane's eyes had narrowed. "How modern of you." The tension in the room had been palpable. George, bless him, had tried to change the subject, but Jane wasn't done. "And what exactly do your parents think of your ambitions?" she'd asked, her voice dripping with disdain. I'd straightened my spine, meeting her gaze. "My parents are proud of me. They've always encouraged me to follow my dreams." Jane had sniffed. "I see. Well, I suppose not everyone values tradition these days." The memory faded, and I found myself back in the present, anger bubbling in my chest. "She hated me from the start, Matthew," I said, my voice tight. "And now she's trying to poison us, literally." Matthew ran a hand through his hair, his face a mask of anguish. I know, but what can we do? She's my mother." I stood up, pacing the room. "We need to confront her, make her understand that her behavior is unacceptable." Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Stay away from my son, you gold-digging harlot, or else." I showed the message to Matthew, watching the color drain from his face. "This has gone too far," he muttered, pulling out his own phone. "I'm calling her right now." As Matthew dialed, the doorbell rang. We exchanged a wary glance. "I'll get it," I said, moving towards the door. I opened it to find Jane standing there, a saccharine smile on her face and a casserole dish in her hands. "Surprise?" she chirped. "I thought I'd drop by with a little home-cooked meal. You two must be so busy with your careers, you probably don't have time for proper nutrition." I stood frozen, my mind racing. Behind me, I could hear Matthew's voice rising as he argued with someone on the phone. Jane's eyes narrowed. "Aren't you going to invite me in, dear?" I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. "Jane, I don't think." "Mom." Matthew appeared behind me, his face a storm of emotions. "What are you doing here?" Jane's smile never wavered. "Just bringing my favorite couple a little treat. Won't you let me in?" I glanced at the casserole dish, remembering the tainted cake. My stomach churned. "Actually, Jane," I said, finding my voice at last, "we need to talk about boundaries, respect, and your recent actions." Jane's smile faltered for a moment before returning, brighter and more menacing than ever. "Oh, Ava," she purred, pushing past me into the house. "I think it's high time we had a little chat, indeed." As the door closed behind her, I caught Matthew's eye. The look we shared was clear. This confrontation was long overdue, and there was no telling how it would end. I never thought I'd dread checking my mailbox, but here I was, heart pounding as I reached for the stack of envelopes. Bills, junk mail, and there it was, another pink envelope reeking of Jane's cloying perfume. With trembling hands, I tore it open. Inside was a cutesy card with kittens on the front. The message inside made my blood run cold. "Tick-tock, dear. Your biological clock is running out. Matthew deserves a real family." I crumpled the card, fury rising in my chest. This was the third one this week. Jane's campaign of psychological warfare was relentless. As I stormed back to the house, I nearly collided with our neighbor, Mrs. Simmons. "Oh, Ava," she exclaimed, her eyes narrowing. "I was just coming to see you." I forced a smile. "Hi, Mrs. Simmons. What can I do for you?" She pursed her lips. "Well, I couldn't help but notice that poor Jane has been looking after your garden lately. It's so kind of her, considering her health issues." I blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, what?" Mrs. Simmons tutted. "Don't play dumb, dear. Jane told us all about how you've been neglecting her, refusing to help with her doctor's appointments, and ignoring her calls." "It's shameful, really," she declared. My jaw dropped. "That's not true at all." "Jane has been." "Save your excuses," Mrs. Simmons cut me off. "We all know the truth. You're too wrapped up in your career to care about family. No wonder you haven't given Matthew children yet." She turned on her heel and marched away, leaving me stunned and humiliated on my own doorstep. Inside, I found Matthew at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. "Matt," I said softly, "what's wrong?" He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "My boss called." Apparently, someone's been sending anonymous emails to the company claiming I'm unstable and unfit for my position. They're considering letting me go. My heart sank. Oh, Matt, I'm so sorry. Do you think? He nodded grimly. It has to be her. Who else would do this? I sank into the chair beside him, my mind reeling. She's destroying our lives, Matt. The neighbors think I'm neglecting her. She's trying to get you fired. What's next? Matthew reached for my hand. We need to confront her together. This has to stop. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Check your email, sweetheart. You might find something interesting. With a sense of dread, I opened my inbox. There, in bold letters, was a message from my company's HR department regarding your resignation. No, I whispered, my voice breaking. She didn't. Matthew peered over my shoulder, his face darkening. She faked your resignation. That's it. We're going over there right now. As we grabbed our keys and headed for the door, it burst open. There stood Jane, her face a mask of concern. Oh, my dears, she cried. I came as soon as I heard. Ava, losing your job like that, and Matthew, those terrible rumors at work. You poor things must be devastated. I stared at her, speechless with rage. How dare she stand there pretending to care when she was the cause of all this misery? Matthew stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. Cut the act, Mom. We know what you've been doing. Jane's eyes widened in feigned innocence. What on earth do you mean, sweetheart? I'm only here to help. Help? I exploded. You call this helping? You've been trying to ruin our lives. Jane's facade cracked for a moment, a flash of malice in her eyes. I'm only doing what's best for my son. He deserves better than you. The tension in the room was palpable. Matthew stood between us, torn between the woman he loved and the mother who raised him. Enough, he said finally. This ends now. We're going to sit down and hash this out once and for all. As we moved to the living room, the air thick with unspoken accusations, I couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation would change everything. For better or worse, our family would never be the same after today. The Christmas tree lights twinkled mockingly as I stood in the corner of Jane and George's living room, clutching my glass of wine like a lifeline. The annual family gathering had barely begun, and already I felt like I was suffocating. More eggnog, anyone? Jane's saccharine voice cut through the forced cheer, her eyes locked onto mine with a predatory gleam. Ava dear, you're not drinking. Surely you're not expecting. The room fell silent. I felt the weight of everyone's stares, especially Matthew's. We'd been trying for a baby for months with no success. It was a sore point, one Jane loved to prod. No, Jane, I said, my voice tight, just watching my alcohol intake. Such a shame, she continued. You know, at your age, every month counts, tick-tock, as they say. I saw Matthew tense, ready to intervene, but I shook my head slightly. I wouldn't let her bait me, not today. As the evening wore on, Jane's barbs became sharper, more frequent. She regaled the family with stories of Matthew's childhood, pointedly mentioning how she'd given up her career to raise him. Of course, some women prefer their jobs to family, she said, her gaze boring into me. I suppose that's why some never become mothers. That was it. I slammed my glass down, wine sloshing over the rim. Enough, Jane. Just say what you really mean. The room went deadly quiet. Jane's eyes widened in fox innocence. Whatever do you mean, Ava? You think I'm a failure as a wife because I work, because I haven't given you grandchildren yet? Well, guess what? My worth isn't determined by my ability to procreate. Jane's mask slipped, revealing the spite beneath. No, your worth is determined by how you treat family, and you, my dear, are sorely lacking. Mom, Matthew interjected, but Jane was on a roll. You've torn this family apart, she hissed, with your selfish career ambitions and your inability to give Matthew children. He deserves better. I felt like I'd been slapped. Tears pricked my eyes as I looked around the room. George stared at his feet, avoiding conflict as usual. Matthew's cousins whispered among themselves, and Matthew just stood there frozen. In that moment, I'd never felt more alone. You want to know why we don't have kids yet, Jane? I said, my voice shaking. Because every doctor we've seen says the stress in our lives is affecting our fertility. And you know what the biggest source of that stress is? You. Gasps echoed around the room. Jane's face turned an alarming shade of red. How dare you blame me for your shortcomings? To confront her. ChatGPT. She shrieked. Matthew, are you going to let her speak to me like this? All eyes turned to Matthew. This was it, the moment he had to choose, his wife or his mother. But Matthew remained silent, his face a mask of anguish. And in his silence, I heard everything I needed to know. Merry Christmas, everyone, I said quietly, grabbing my coat. I think it's best if I go. As I walked out into the cold night air, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, half hoping to see Matthew. Instead, it was George. Ava, wait, he said, his voice gentle. I'm so sorry. What Jane said. It wasn't right. I smiled sadly. But you didn't stop her, did you, George? None of you ever do. He looked away, shame written across his face. You're right, and that needs to change. As I drove home alone, tears streaming down my face, I realized something had to give. I couldn't keep living like this, caught between my love for Matthew and the toxicity of his family. It was time to make a choice, and as the Christmas lights faded in my rearview mirror, I knew exactly what I had to do. I sat on our living room couch, staring at the packed suitcase by the door. 3 days had passed since the Christmas disaster, and Matthew still hadn't come home. My phone buzzed, another text from him. I'm sorry, I need more time. More time for what? To choose between his wife and his mother? The thought made my stomach churn. A knock at the door startled me. I opened it, half expecting to see Matthew. Instead, I found myself face to face with George. Ava, he said, his voice heavy with concern. May I come in? I nodded, stepping aside. George entered, his eyes landing on my suitcase. You're leaving? He asked, alarm evident in his tone. I shrugged, fighting back tears. I don't know, maybe. I can't keep living like this, George. He sighed, sinking into an armchair. I understand, and that's why I'm here. It's time we talked about Jane. My heart raced. Was this another ambush? But George's next words shocked me to my core. I'm leaving her, Ava. I filed for divorce. I gaped at him, struggling to process this information. What? But why now? George's eyes met mine, filled with remorse and determination. Because I've been a coward for far too long. What Jane did at Christmas was the last straw. I've enabled her behavior for years, and it stops now. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small notebook. I've been keeping track of Jane's episodes, the lies, the manipulation, everything. I thought maybe if I documented it, I'd find the courage to confront her. I took the notebook from him, flipping through the pages filled with dates and detailed accounts of Jane's actions. George, it's the truth, Ava, he said, his voice breaking. I should have stood up to her years ago, but I was too afraid. I'm so sorry for everything she's put you through. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. Thank you, George. This means more than you know. He reached out, squeezing my hand. You're a good person, Ava. You deserve better than this. And so does Matthew. As George left, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of the end of Jane's reign of terror. Maybe, just maybe, we could all find some peace. Later that evening, I sat down with my phone, my heart heavy with uncertainty. I needed to talk to Matthew to tell him everything George had said. But as I dialed his number, the door creaked open and Matthew walked in, looking exhausted. Ava, he said, his voice soft and full of regret. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do. I stood up, walking over to him. Matt, we need to talk. George was here. He filed for divorce from Jane. Matthew's eyes widened in shock. He did. I nodded, holding up the notebook. He's been documenting everything. The lies, the manipulation, all of it. He wants to make things right. Matthew sank into the couch, his head in his hands. I can't believe it. After all these years, I sat down beside him, taking his hand. Matt, we can't keep living like this. I love you, but something has to change. We need to stand up to her together. But I never did, until now. As George flipped through the pages, recounting incident after incident, I felt a mix of vindication and horror. Jane's toxicity ran deeper than I had ever imagined. Does Matthew know? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. George shook his head. Not yet. I wanted to tell you first, to apologize for not standing up for you sooner, and to ask for your help. My help? Yes, Matthew, he's struggling, Ava. Jane's got her claws in deep. He needs us, both of us, to show him the truth. Just then, my phone buzzed again. Another text from Matthew. I'm coming home. We need to talk. I showed George the message, my heart pounding. He's on his way. George stood, determination etched on his face. Good. It's time we face this as a family, a real family. As we waited for Matthew, I felt a strange mix of hope and fear. Could this be the turning point we needed? The sound of a key in the lock made us both turn. Matthew walked in, his eyes widening at the sight of his father. Dad, what are you doing here? George stepped forward, placing a hand on Matthew's shoulder. Son, we need to talk about your mother. Matthew's face hardened. If you're here to defend her. No, George interrupted. I'm here to tell you the truth. All of it. For the next hour, George laid it all out. Years of manipulation, lies, and toxic behavior. Matthew listened in stunned silence, his face a storm of emotions. When George finished, Matthew turned to me, his eyes brimmy with tears. Ava, I'm so sorry. I had no idea it was this bad. I took his hand, squeezing it gently. It's not your fault, Matt, but we can't go on like this. We have to make a choice. Matthew nodded, a new resolve in his eyes. You're right, both of you are. It's time we stood up to Mom together. As the three of us sat there planning our next move, I felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be tough, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone in this fight. George cleared his throat. There's one more thing you both should know. I've decided to divorce Jane. The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. This was it, the point of no return. Whatever happened next would change our family forever. I looked at Matthew, seeing the same mix of fear and determination in his eyes that I felt. We were at a crossroads, and the path we chose would define our future. So I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. What do we do now? The courthouse loomed before us, a monolithic symbol of the battle we were about to face. George's hand trembled as he clutched the divorce papers, his face a mix of determination and fear. Matthew stood beside him, jaw clenched, while I hovered nearby, my heart racing. Are you sure about this, Dad? Matthew asked, his voice barely above a whisper. George nodded, his eyes steely. It's time, son. We can't let her toxicity poison our lives any longer. As we climbed the steps, a familiar voice rang out behind us. Well, what a touching family outing. We turned to see Jane, her lips curved in a cruel smile. She was impeccably dressed as always, but there was a wild look in her eyes that sent chills down my spine. Mom, Matthew started, but Jane cut him off with a wave of her hand. Save it, she spat. I know what this is. You're all conspiring against me, my own family, turning their backs on me. George stepped forward, his voice steady. Jane, this isn't a conspiracy. It's the consequence of your actions. We're here to file for divorce. Jane's face contorted with rage. Divorce? You can't divorce me. I've given you everything, my youth, my dreams, my life. And you've taken just as much from us, I found myself saying, surprising even myself with my boldness. Jane's eyes locked onto mine, blazing with hatred. You, she hissed, this is all your fault. You've poisoned them against me. Before I could react, Jane lunged at me, her manicured nails raking across my face. I stumbled backward, shocked by the sudden attack. Matthew jumped between us, restraining his mother as she thrashed and screamed. Let go of me. She's ruined everything. Our family, our lives. Security guards rushed over, pulling Jane away. As they escorted her off, she turned back, her face a mask of venom. This isn't over, she snarled. I'll destroy you all for this betrayal. Inside the courthouse, we sat in stunned silence, waiting for our turn to file the papers. My cheeks stung where Jane had scratched me, a physical reminder of the emotional wounds she'd inflicted over the years. I'm so sorry, Ava, Matthew murmured gently, touching my face. I never thought she'd. God, what have we done? I took his hand, squeezing it reassuringly. We're doing what's right, Matt. It's not easy, but it's necessary. George nodded, his face ashen. I should have done this years ago. Maybe then. He trailed off, but we all knew what he meant. Maybe then things wouldn't have gotten this bad. Maybe we could have salvaged some semblance of a normal family. As we waited, my phone buzzed incessantly. Messages flooded in from friends, neighbors, even colleagues. Jane had wasted no time spreading her version of events, telling everyone that we had you committed, George. I scrolled through the messages, accusations that we were trying to steal your assets and destroy your reputation. George's face fell. Of course she is. It's always been about control with Jane. If she can't have it, she'll burn everything to the ground. Just then, Matthew's phone rang. He answered, his face growing paler by the second. It's my boss, he whispered, covering the mouthpiece. Jane's called the company, claiming I'm having a mental breakdown and need to be placed on leave. I felt the walls closing in. Jane's web of lies and manipulation was spreading, threatening to unravel everything we'd worked for. Our careers, our reputations, our very lives were hanging in the balance. As Matthew argued with his boss, trying to explain the situation, I caught George's eye. The same thought passed between us. How far would Jane go in her quest for revenge? And more importantly, how could we stop her before she destroyed everything we held dear? The court clerk called our name, jolting us back to reality. This was it, the point of no return. As we stood to follow her into the judge's chambers, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a war we might not be prepared to fight. The aftermath of George's divorce filing was like a tornado tearing through our lives. Jane's venomous lies spread through the community like wildfire, leaving destruction in their wake. I stood on our front porch, watching as yet another neighbor hurried past, averting their eyes. The isolation was suffocating. George's voice called from inside. You need to see this. I rushed back in to find George and Matthew huddled around a laptop. On the screen was a local community forum, ablaze with posts about us. She's telling everyone I'm abusive, Matthew said, his voice cracking. That I've been manipulating Dad into the divorce, that we're after his money. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. This is insane. We have to do something. George nodded, a determined glint in his eye. I've been making some calls. It's time we fought back. Over the next few days, George became a man possessed. He went door to door, speaking to neighbors and showing them his notebook of Jane's misdeeds. I watched in awe as he transformed from the passive man I'd known into a fierce defender of the truth. But Jane wasn't going down without a fight. As George made headway with the neighbors, she upped her game. Suddenly, she was everywhere. At the grocery store, the park, even outside my office, always playing the part of the frail, wronged woman. Did you see her at the pharmacy? Mrs. Simmons cornered me one afternoon. Poor dear could barely walk. Are you sure you're not being too harsh on her? I bit back a scream of frustration. Mrs. Simmons, it's all an act. Jane is. Now, she cut me off. I know you're going through a rough patch, but let's not say things we can't take back. As Mrs. Simmons walked away, I felt the walls closing in. How could we fight an enemy who wielded sympathy as a weapon? The answer came in an unexpected form. One evening, as we sat around our dining table plotting our next move, a knock at the door interrupted us. Jane's phone buzzed. It's Dr. Patel, George said, frowning. Jane's doctor. We listened in stunned silence as George spoke to the doctor. When he hung up, his face was a mix of triumph and disgust. Jane's been faking her health issues, he said. Dr. Patel has been suspicious for a while and is willing to testify that there's nothing physically wrong with her. It was the break we needed. Armed with this information, we launched a counter-offensive. George spoke to the local paper, sharing his story and the truth about Jane's deception. Matthew reached out to his company, explaining the situation with Dr. Patel's statement backing him. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Neighbors who had shunned us started to reach out, offering apologies and support. Jane's web of lies began to unravel. But just as we thought we were gaining ground, disaster struck. I woke up one morning to find our front yard filled with news vans and reporters. Ava, Matthew called from the living room. You need to see this. On the TV, Jane stood before a sea of microphones, tears streaming down her face. My own family, she sobbed, they've turned against me all because I dared to speak the truth about their greed and manipulation. My heart sank as I watched the sympathetic nods of the reporters. Jane had taken her performance to a national stage. As the doorbell began to ring incessantly with reporters clamoring for our side of the story, I felt a wave of despair wash over me. How could we possibly fight this? Our private family drama had become a public spectacle, and Jane was playing the role of the victim to perfection. Matthew turned to me, his face pale. What do we do now? I looked from him to George, both men looking more defeated than I'd ever seen them. This was it, the moment that would define our future. We could either crumble under the pressure or stand up and fight. Taking a deep breath, I squared my shoulders. "We tell our story," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "All of it. No more hiding, no more shame. It's time the world knew the truth about Jane." As I reached for the door, ready to face the media storm outside, I silently prayed we were making the right choice. Because if this didn't work, we'd be giving Jane exactly what she wanted: our complete and utter destruction. The courtroom fell silent as Jane took the stand, her face a mask of practiced sorrow. I gripped Matthew's hand tightly, my heart pounding. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. "Mrs. Thompson," our lawyer began, "can you explain why you've been spreading false information about your family?" Jane's eyes welled with tears. "I've only ever told the truth. My family has abandoned me, left me to suffer alone." I felt a surge of anger, but before I could react, our lawyer produced a familiar notebook, George's meticulous record of Jane's behavior. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to present evidence of Mrs. Thompson's long history of manipulation and deceit." As our lawyer read excerpt after damning excerpt, I watched Jane's facade crumble. Her eyes darted around the courtroom, searching for sympathy but finding none. Then came the coup de grace. Dr. Patel's testimony. He calmly explained how Jane had fabricated her health issues, using them to garner sympathy and control her family. In my professional opinion, Dr. Patel concluded, Mrs. Thompson is in perfect health. Her claims of debilitating illness are entirely false. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jane's face contorted with rage, her mask finally slipping completely. "You ungrateful wretches," she shrieked, pointing at us. "After everything I've done for you?" As security restrained her, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The truth was out, and Jane could no longer hide behind her lies. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Jane was ordered to cease all contact with us, and George's divorce was finalized. As we left the courthouse, a crowd of reporters waited. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," one called out, "how do you feel about the verdict?" I looked at Matthew and George, seeing my own mix of relief and sadness mirrored in their eyes. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward. "We're relieved that the truth has come to light," I said, my voice steady. "But more than that, we're hopeful that we can now move forward and heal as a family." In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to return to normal. Our neighbors, once wary, now greeted us warmly. Matthew's company, satisfied with the court's findings, welcomed him back with open arms. But the biggest surprise came on a quiet Sunday morning. As Matthew and I sat at the breakfast table, I felt a sudden wave of nausea. "Ava," Matthew's voice was concerned, "are you okay?" I looked up at him, a smile spreading across my face as realization dawned. "Matthew, I think I'm pregnant." The joy that filled our home that day was indescribable. When we shared the news with George, his eyes filled with happy tears. "Life finds a way," he said, hugging us both, even in the darkest times. As I stood there surrounded by the love of my family, I realized something profound. The ordeal with Jane, as painful as it had been, had made us stronger. We had faced the storm together and come out the other side, battered but unbroken. Months later, as I held our newborn daughter in my arms with Matthew and George by my side, I felt a sense of peace I'd never known before. We had weathered the worst and emerged victorious, not just over Jane's toxicity, but over the fear and doubt that had plagued us for so long. "Welcome to the world, little one," I whispered, kissing her forehead. "You're born into a family that knows the true meaning of love and loyalty." Matthew squeezed my shoulder, his eyes shining with pride and love. "We've come so far," he murmured. George nodded, gently touching his granddaughter's cheek. "And we have so much to look forward to." As I gazed at my daughter's innocent face, I made a silent promise. She would grow up knowing only love and support, free from the toxic influences that had nearly torn us apart. We had broken the cycle and in doing so, given her the greatest gift of all, a family built on trust, respect, and unconditional love. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but I knew we could face anything as long as we stood together. We had weathered the storm, and now, at last, we could bask in the sunlight of a brighter tomorrow.